The first thing Captain Sarah Chen noticed wasn't the alarm bells screaming through the cockpit of the B-52 Stratofortress, or the way the massive aircraft shuddered like a wounded bird 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't even the acrid smell of burning electronics that made her eyes water behind her oxygen mask. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Major Tom Bradley, her co-pilot of 3 years, had stopped talking mid-sentence. One moment he'd been reading off the navigation checklist in that steady Oklahoma drawl she'd grown to depend on, and the next moment nothing. Just the terrible quiet of a voice that should have been there but wasn't. Tom, Sarah's gloved hand, found the yoke, steadying the bomber as it began to drift left. The aircraft felt different now, sluggish and unresponsive, like a horse favoring an injured leg. Tom, I need those engine readings. When she turned to look at him, her breath caught in her throat. Major Bradley's head was tilted back against his ejection seat, his breathing shallow and labored. His right hand clutched at his chest over the olive-green flight suit, and even through the tinted visor of his helmet, she could see the pale gray color creeping across his face. The heart attack had claimed her co-pilot at the worst possible moment. Engine number 6, the outboard engine on the right wing, had just suffered what the technical manuals euphemistically called an uncontained failure. In reality, pieces of the turbofan engine had torn through the wing structure like shrapnel, severing hydraulic lines and electrical conduits. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in angry reds and ambers, each one representing a system that was failing or already gone. Sarah Chen had been flying for 22 years, first as a wild-eyed second lieutenant fresh out of flight school, then through countless missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, and finally to this moment, her first command of a B-52 on a routine training flight that had become anything but routine. She was the first Asian American woman to pilot the massive strategic bomber, a fact that had been mentioned in every interview and every profile written about her. What they never mentioned was how it felt to carry that weight, to know that every mistake would be magnified, every success diminished. But right now, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was keeping 60 tons of metal and fuel in the sky with 3 other crew members depending on her. Navigator, I need our position and nearest suitable airfield. Her voice cut through the chaos with practiced calm. Even as her mind raced through emergency procedures, she'd practiced hundreds of times but never hoped to use. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the navigator seated behind her, responded immediately. Ma'am, we're 200 miles northwest of Fairchild Air Force Base. I'm calculating approach vectors now. Maria had been Sarah's navigator for 18 months, a brilliant young woman from East LA who could plot a course through a thunderstorm while eating a sandwich. Her voice remained steady, professional, but Sarah could hear the subtle tension that meant Maria understood exactly how serious their situation had become. The electronic warfare officer, Technical Sergeant James Wright, leaned forward from his position at the rear of the cockpit. Captain, I'm showing multiple system failures. We've lost primary and backup hydraulic pressure on the right wing. Flight controls are responding, but we're operating on manual reversion. Wright was the oldest member of the crew at 38. A soft-spoken man from rural Montana who treated the B-52's complex electronic systems like a master mechanic might tend to a vintage car, with patience, intuition, and an almost supernatural understanding of how things should sound and feel when they were working correctly. Sarah's training kicked in, the thousands of hours of simulator time and emergency procedures flowing through her mind like muscle memory. First priority, maintain control of the aircraft. Second priority, assess the damage. Third priority, get everyone home alive. She reached over and checked Tom's pulse. Still there, but weak and irregular. His breathing was shallow. and when she lifted his visor, she could see the waxy pallor of a man whose heart was struggling to keep him conscious. In a hospital, he might survive. At 35,000 feet with the nearest medical facility hundreds of miles away, his chances diminished with every passing minute. "Wright, can you assist the co-pilot?" Sarah's hands never left the controls. As she spoke, the B-52 required constant attention now, like a wounded animal that might bolt or collapse at any moment. "On it, Captain." Wright unbuckled from his station and moved forward, his movements careful and deliberate in the cramped confines of the cockpit. He'd been a paramedic before joining the Air Force, and his steady hands began checking Tom's vital signs with professional efficiency. The radio crackled to life with the voice of the air traffic controller at Fairchild. "Phantom 77, we copy your emergency declaration. We're clearing all traffic and standing by emergency services. What are your intentions?" Sarah keyed her mic. "Fairchild Tower, Phantom 77 is declaring an in-flight emergency. We have one engine out, multiple system failures, and a medical emergency on board. Requesting priority handling and immediate medical assistance upon landing." "Phantom 77, you're cleared direct to Fairchild. Current weather is winds from the northwest at 15 knots, visibility 10 miles, scattered clouds at 8,000 feet. Emergency vehicles are being positioned." As Sarah acknowledged the transmission, she felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. Every decision from this moment forward would determine whether her crew lived or died. There was no manual for this specific combination of emergencies, no checklist that covered a simultaneous engine failure, system cascade, and medical crisis. There was only her experience, her training, and her ability to think clearly under pressure. The B-52 Stratofortress was a child of the Cold War, first flown in 1952 and built to carry nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory. The particular aircraft Sarah was flying, tail number 60034, had been built in 1961, making it older than she was. It had flown missions over Vietnam, patrolled the Arctic during tense standoffs with Soviet bombers, and served as a symbol of American air power. For 6 decades, the crew called her Old Faithful, and like many B-52s, she had been upgraded and modernized countless times, while retaining the basic configuration that had proven so successful. But age brought its own challenges. The aircraft's hydraulic systems, electrical networks, and control surfaces had been maintained and repaired so many times that troubleshooting problems required an almost archaeological understanding of which modifications had been made when. Sarah knew every quirk of this particular bomber, from the slight pull to the right that required constant trim, adjustments to the way the number 3 engine ran slightly hot on humid days. Now, with one engine dead and multiple systems failing, Old Faithful felt different under her hands. The control responses were sluggish, and she could feel the aircraft wanting to roll right toward the dead engine. The remaining 7 engines provided plenty of power to maintain flight, but the asymmetric thrust required constant attention. Her left leg ached from the pressure she was applying to the rudder pedal to keep the aircraft flying straight. Sarah Chen had always believed that flying was equal parts science and art, a delicate balance between following procedures and trusting instincts honed through thousands of hours in the cockpit. As she guided the wounded B-52 through the darkening sky toward Fairchild Air Force Base, her mind drifted to the early morning ritual that had started this day, a day that had begun like any other but was ending as the most challenging of her career. She had been awake since 4:30 that morning, not because of an alarm, but because her internal clock had been conditioned by 22 years of military service to wake her before dawn. In the darkness of her small apartment off base, she had moved through the familiar routine that prepared her for flight. A quick shower, a breakfast of steel-cut oats and black coffee, 15 minutes of stretching exercises that kept her back from seizing up during long missions, and a careful review of the weather reports and flight plan. The apartment was spartanly furnished. Military housing allowances didn't stretch far in the Pacific Northwest, but every item had been chosen with care. A small bookshelf held volumes on aviation history, biographies of pioneering pilots, and a few worn paperback novels that she read and reread during long deployments. On the wall hung a photograph of her parents at her commissioning ceremony, their faces beaming with pride and bewilderment that their shy daughter had chosen to make her living in the sky. Next to it was her diploma from the Air Force Academy, the embossed seal still bright after all these years. Sarah's morning routine was interrupted only by a brief phone call from her younger brother David, who was finishing his surgical residency at Johns Hopkins. Despite the early hour, he'd called to wish her luck on what he knew was an important training flight, one where her performance would be closely scrutinized by senior officers evaluating her for promotion to lieutenant colonel. "You know Mom still prays for you every time you fly," David had said, his voice carrying the gentle teasing that had characterized their relationship since childhood. "Mom prays for me when I drive to the grocery store," Sarah had replied, but she'd been smiling as she said it. Their mother's faith had been a constant presence in their lives, a source of strength that had sustained the family through her father's long hours at the engineering firm and the subtle challenges of being an Asian family in a predominantly white Iowa town. The drive to the base had taken her past farmland that reminded her of home, rolling hills dotted with cattle and bounded by fences that seemed to stretch to the horizon. She'd stopped at a gas station for another cup of coffee and found herself in conversation with the elderly owner, a veteran of the Vietnam War who recognized her flight suit and thanked her for her service. It was a brief interaction, but one that reminded her of why she'd chosen to wear the uniform, not for glory or recognition, but for the quiet satisfaction of serving something larger than herself. At the base, she'd arrived early for the pre-flight briefing, a habit that had served her well throughout her career. Major Bradley was already there, reviewing weather reports and checking his personal equipment with the methodical precision that made him an excellent co-pilot. They'd worked together for 3 years, long enough to develop the kind of professional shorthand that made them an effective team. Tom Bradley was everything Sarah wasn't: tall where she was average height, gregarious where she was reserved, quick to joke where she was serious. He'd grown up on a cattle ranch in Oklahoma, the third generation of his family to work the same land, and he'd brought to flying the same patient persistence that had made his family successful farmers. He was also, Sarah knew, one of the finest aviators she'd ever flown with, possessed of an intuitive understanding of how aircraft behaved that couldn't be taught in any manual. During the briefing, Tom had seemed his usual self-cracking jokes about the weather, complaining about the early hour, sharing stories about his weekend fishing trip with his teenage son. If he'd been experiencing any symptoms of the cardiac event that would later incapacitate him, he'd hidden them well. Looking back now, Sarah wondered if there had been subtle signs she'd missed, moments when he'd seemed slightly out of breath, or paused longer than usual before responding to a question. The truth was that Sarah had been preoccupied with her own concerns that morning. The training flight was part of a larger evaluation process, one that would determine whether she'd be selected for promotion and, more importantly, whether she'd be chosen to command her own squadron. It would make her the first Asian American woman to lead a B-52 squadron, a milestone that carried both pride and pressure in equal measure. The weight of representation had been a constant companion throughout Sarah's career. Every mistake was scrutinized for signs that women weren't suited for combat roles. Every success was diminished as an exception that proved the rule. She'd learned early to keep her emotions hidden, to project a confidence she didn't always feel, and to work twice as hard as her male counterparts to earn half the recognition. But there had been allies along the way. Colonel Patricia "Pat" Morrison, the first woman to pilot a B-52 in combat, had mentored Sarah through her early years as a co-pilot, teaching her not just the technical aspects of flying the bomber, but the subtle politics of succeeding in a male-dominated profession. Lieutenant Colonel James "Thunder" Thompson, her first aircraft commander, had judged her solely on her ability and had written fitness reports that opened doors to increasingly challenging assignments, and there had been moments of pure joy that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. The first time she'd soloed in a T-6 trainer as a cadet, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch like a well-trained horse. The first time she'd seen the curvature of the Earth from the cockpit of a B-52, a view that put human concerns into cosmic perspective. The first time she'd executed a perfect landing in challenging crosswinds, earning a nod of approval from an instructor who rarely offered praise. Flying had given Sarah a sense of purpose and identity that nothing else could match. In the cockpit, her gender and ethnicity were irrelevant, only skill mattered, only results counted. The aircraft didn't care about her background or her family's emigration story. It responded to her inputs with mechanical precision, rewarding competence and punishing carelessness with absolute impartiality. But even as she'd risen through the ranks, earning the respect of her peers and the trust of her superiors, Sarah had never forgotten the young girl who'd felt like an outsider in her own hometown. That girl lived inside her still, the one who'd learned to speak perfect English without an accent because she'd been mocked for her mother's halting pronunciation, who'd studied twice as hard as her classmates because she knew she'd have to be exceptional to be considered equal. The memory of that girl had driven Sarah to excel in everything she attempted. She'd graduated second in her class from the Air Force Academy, earned her pilot wins with distinction, and completed every advanced training program available to bomber pilots. She'd flown combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, earned a Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during a particularly challenging rescue operation, and served as an instructor pilot for younger aviators learning to fly the B-52. For all her accomplishments, Sarah struggled with moments of self-doubt that she never shared with anyone. Late at night, lying in her narrow military-issued bed, she sometimes wondered if she was truly as good as her record suggested, or if she'd been given opportunities because the Air Force needed diversity statistics for their promotion boards. The rational part of her mind knew that her achievements were real, earned through hard work and dedication, but the insecure part, the part shaped by years of subtle discrimination and overt prejudice, whispered that she was an imposter who'd fooled everyone, including herself. Those doubts had been particularly strong in recent months as the promotion board approached. Sarah had watched male colleagues with similar records advance faster, receive better assignments, and face less scrutiny for their mistakes. She'd seen promising female officers leave the service, rather than fight battles that their male counterparts never had to face. The statistics were stark: women made up less than 5% of Air Force pilots, and the percentage dropped even further at senior leadership levels. But Sarah had persevered, driven by a combination of stubborn pride and genuine love for her profession. She believed deeply in the mission of the Air Force, in the idea that a strong defense deterred conflict and protected the freedoms that had allowed her family to prosper in America. She also knew that her success opened doors for other women, particularly women of color, who might follow in her footsteps. Now, as she flew the damaged B-52 through the gathering darkness, Sarah carried all of this history with her: the dreams of her immigrant parents, the expectations of her peers, the hopes of young women who might see her example and believe that they too could reach for the sky. The weight was enormous, but it was also a source of strength, reminding her that this moment was about more than just bringing one aircraft safely home. The first indication that their emergency was about to become exponentially worse came at 18,000 feet, still 40 miles from Fairchild Air Force Base. Sarah had been concentrating on managing the asymmetric thrust from the failed engine when a new master caution light illuminated the cockpit in harsh amber light. "Captain, we've got a problem with the number 2 engine," Wright announced from his position, monitoring the aircraft systems. His voice carried a note of controlled alarm that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Oil pressure is dropping rapidly, and EGT is climbing past redline." Sarah's eyes flicked to the engine instruments, and her heart sank. Engine number 2 was on the left wing, and if they lost it in addition to the already failed number 6 engine, they would face an almost impossible situation: asymmetric thrust that would make the aircraft nearly uncontrollable, especially during the delicate phase of landing. "How much time do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing knot of fear in her stomach. "At this rate of oil loss, maybe 10 minutes before we have to shut it down," Wright replied. "If the engine seizes, we could lose parts of the wing structure." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. A second engine failure would leave them with 6 remaining engines, but more critically, it would create a severe imbalance of thrust between the left and right sides of the aircraft. The B-52's flight manual contained procedures for single-engine failures, but dual-engine failures on opposite wings was an emergency configuration that pilots trained for but hoped never to experience. "Santos, how far to the runway?" Sarah called to her navigator. 38 miles and closing, ma'am. We should have the field in sight in about 8 minutes. 8 minutes to the runway, 10 minutes before they had to shut down the second engine. The math was cruel but simple. They might make it, but only if everything else went perfectly. And in Sarah's experience, when emergencies started cascading, perfection became an increasingly elusive goal. The radio crackled with another transmission from Fairchild Tower. "Phantom 77, we show you descending through flight level 1-8-0. Are you able to maintain your current approach profile?" "Fairchild Tower, Phantom 77 is declaring a secondary emergency. We have a second engine showing signs of failure. We may need to shut down number 2 engine before reaching the field." The brief pause that followed Sarah's transmission spoke volumes about the gravity of their situation. Even air traffic controllers, trained to handle emergencies with calm professionalism, understood that a B-52, with engines failing on opposite wings, was facing a potentially insurmountable challenge. Phantom 77 understood. "We're alerting all emergency services and clearing the airspace. You are cleared for any approach you require." As they continued their descent toward Fairchild, Sarah found herself drawing on reserves of skill and knowledge she'd accumulated over 2 decades of flying. The B-52 was a forgiving aircraft in many respects, designed to survive battle damage and continue the mission. But it had its limits, and she was rapidly approaching them. The first real test came as engine number 2 finally succumbed to its internal failures. The oil pressure dropped to 0, and the exhaust gas temperature spiked beyond the red line on the gauge. Sarah had no choice but to shut down the engine before it catastrophically failed and potentially damaged the wing structure. "Right, initiate shutdown procedures for number 2 engine," she ordered, her hands tightening on the yoke as she prepared for the aircraft's reaction. The moment the engine wound down to a stop, the B-52 began to yaw violently to the left. Remaining engines on the right wing were now producing significantly more thrust than those on the left, creating a turning moment that threatened to send them into an uncontrollable roll. Sarah's left leg strained against the rudder pedal, fighting to keep the aircraft flying straight as they descended toward the runway. "Captain, we're showing significant rudder deflection," Wright reported, his voice tight with concentration, as he monitored the aircraft's control systems. "We're approaching the limits of what the flight controls can compensate for." Sarah could feel it in her legs and arms, the constant pressure required to keep the aircraft under control. The asymmetric thrust was like wrestling with a giant, invisible hand that wanted to spin them into the ground. Every small input required enormous effort, and she knew that maintaining control during the final approach and landing would push both her and the aircraft to their absolute limits. But the worst was yet to come. As they passed through 12,000 feet, still 20 miles from the runway, Wright's voice cut through the cockpit with news that made Sarah's heart race. "Captain, Major Bradley's condition is deteriorating rapidly. His pulse is very weak, and his breathing is becoming irregular." Sarah glanced back at her co-pilot, and what she saw made her stomach clench with fear. Tom's face was ashen, his breathing shallow and labored. Even unconscious, he seemed to be fighting for each breath, his body struggling against the cardiac event that was slowly shutting down his systems. The cruel mathematics of their situation became starkly clear. They needed to get Tom to medical attention as quickly as possible, but landing the damaged aircraft safely would require patience, precision, and careful management of their approach. Every minute they saved in getting to the runway might be a minute that could save Tom's life, but rushing the approach could kill them all. "Santos, what's our minimum safe approach speed with the current configuration?" Sarah asked, her mind racing through performance calculations. "Ma'am, with 2 engines out and the asymmetric thrust, I'd recommend no slower than 160 knots until we're committed to landing. Any slower and we risk losing control authority." 160 knots was fast for a B-52 approach, normally. They would fly the pattern at around 140 knots, but with the damaged aircraft, they needed the extra airspeed to maintain control. The faster approach would also mean a longer landing roll, but Fairchild's runway was long enough to accommodate them if Sarah could keep the aircraft on the CENTERLINE. As they passed through 10,000 feet, the lights of Fairchild Air Force Base appeared ahead of them like a constellation of hope in the darkness. Sarah could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, and crash rescue equipment standing by for what everyone hoped would be an uneventful landing, but preparing for the worst-case scenario. Fairchild Tower. Phantom 77 has the field in sight. We're configured for a straight-in approach to runway 06. Phantom 77, you're cleared to land runway 06. Emergency vehicles are standing by. The final approach began at 8,000 feet, Sarah carefully managing the aircraft's descent while fighting the constant pull of the asymmetric thrust. Her legs ached from the pressure on the rudder pedals, and sweat stung her eyes despite the cool temperature in the cockpit. Every control input had to be precise and deliberate. Too much rudder, and they would overcorrect. Too little, and the aircraft would drift off course. Wright continued to monitor Tom's condition, his updates becoming increasingly urgent. "Captain, his pulse is very weak. We're losing him." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Tom Bradley wasn't just her co-pilot. He was her friend, her flying partner, and the father of 2 teenage children who were waiting for him to come home. The thought of losing him drove her to push the aircraft harder, to descend faster toward the runway where medical help was waiting. But the B-52 fought back against her urgency. At 6,000 feet, they encountered wind shear that made the aircraft buck and yaw, threatening to overcome her control inputs. Sarah had to reduce power and shallow their descent, trading precious time for safety as they worked their way through the turbulent air. Come on," she whispered to herself, her hands dancing over the controls as she tried to coax the damaged bomber through the unstable air. "Just hold together a little longer." At 3,000 feet, they broke through the cloud layer, and the runway came into clear view. 2 miles of concrete stretching ahead of them like a lifeline. Sarah could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the taxiways, their red and blue lights creating a light show that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But even as the runway grew larger in their windscreen, new problems emerged. The damaged wing was creating unusual flight characteristics, causing the aircraft to respond differently to control inputs than Sarah expected. What should have been a routine correction to line up with the center line instead sent them drifting to the right, requiring a large rudder input to bring them back on course. 2 miles out, Santos called from the navigator's station. "You're doing great, Captain." Sarah appreciated the encouragement, but she knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Landing a B-52 under normal circumstances required precise coordination of multiple controls and careful management of the aircraft's energy state. Landing with 2 engines out on opposite wings would require near-perfect execution of techniques she'd practiced in the simulator but never hoped to use in real life. At 1 mile from the runway threshold, Sarah began configuring the aircraft for landing. The landing gear extended with reassuring mechanical sounds, and the flaps moved to their approach setting despite the damage to the wing's hydraulic systems. The B-52 was showing its age but also its rugged reliability systems that had been built in the 1960s were still functioning when they were needed most, but as they descended through 500 feet above the ground, Sarah encountered the challenge she'd been dreading most. The asymmetric thrust that had been manageable at higher speeds became increasingly difficult to control as they slowed for landing. The aircraft wanted to turn left toward the dead engines, and even with full rudder deflection, she was struggling to keep them aligned with the runway centerline. "Power back on 7 and 8, she called to Wright, asking him to reduce thrust on the remaining engines on the right wing. It was a delicate balance, too much power, and they couldn't control the aircraft's direction, too little, and they wouldn't be able to maintain flying speed. "Captain, we're approaching minimum controllable airspeed," Wright warned, his voice tight with concern. Sarah felt the aircraft's responses becoming increasingly sluggish as they slowed. The flight controls that had been firm and responsive at higher speeds now felt mushy and imprecise. Every correction she made seemed to take longer to register, and the margin for error was shrinking with each passing second. At 300 feet above the runway, disaster nearly struck. A gust of wind caught the damaged wing, causing the aircraft to roll sharply to the right. Sarah instinctively added power and applied opposite aileron, but the response was delayed and insufficient. For a terrifying moment, the B-52 was pointed away from the runway, drifting toward the parallel taxiway where emergency vehicles were positioned. "Come on, come back to me," Sarah muttered through gritted teeth, fighting with every ounce of strength to bring the aircraft back under control. Her arms burned with effort, and she could taste blood where she'd bitten her tongue during the violent maneuver. Slowly, agonizingly, the bomber responded to her inputs. The nose swung back toward the runway centerline, and Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft obeying her commands. But they were now low and fast, approaching the runway at an angle that would require precise timing to execute safely. 100 feet, Santos called out, her voice steady despite the drama unfolding in front of her. Sarah's world narrowed to the basic elements of flight airspeed, altitude, and runway alignment. Everything else faded away, the pain in her arms and legs, the worry about Tom's condition, the knowledge that dozens of people on the ground were watching and waiting to see if she could pull off what many would consider an impossible landing. 50 feet, Santos continued. "Looking good, Captain." The runway rushed up to meet them, and Sarah felt the familiar flutter in her stomach that came with every landing, the moment when the aircraft transitioned from flying machine to ground vehicle, when the laws of aerodynamics gave way to the simpler physics of rolling friction and braking action. The main landing gear touched down with a satisfying thump, followed immediately by the nose gear as Sarah lowered the aircraft's attitude. The moment all 3 sets of wheels were on the ground, she reversed the thrust on the remaining engines and applied the wheel brakes, feeling the massive bomber begin to slow. But their troubles weren't over yet. The asymmetric thrust that had made flying so difficult now made stopping even more challenging. Despite her best efforts to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the runway, the B-52 began to veer toward the left edge of the concrete. Sarah stood on the right brake pedal, using differential braking to counter the turning moment. but the aircraft's momentum was carrying them inexorably toward the runway lights. "We're going off the runway," Wright announced, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone stating an inevitable fact. Sarah made a split-second decision that would haunt her for years afterward. Rather than continue fighting the aircraft's desire to turn left, she decided to use the remaining engines to help control their direction. She advanced the throttles on engines 1 and 3, adding power to help straighten their path down the runway. The gamble worked, but barely. The additional thrust helped counter the turning moment, allowing Sarah to regain control of the aircraft's direction. They rolled to a stop just short of the runway's midpoint, still on the concrete, but uncomfortably close to the edge. For a moment, the cockpit was silent except for the sound of engines winding down and the crew's labored breathing. Then Wright's voice cut through the quiet with the words that made everything they'd endured worthwhile. "We're down safe. Emergency vehicles are approaching." 3 weeks after the emergency landing, Sarah Chen found herself in a sterile, fluorescent-lit debriefing room at Fairchild Air Force Base, facing a panel of senior officers whose expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. What should have been recognition for extraordinary flying had become an inquisition that questioned not just her decisions during the emergency, but her very right to wear the uniform. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Colonel Marcus Webb, the wing commander, sat at the center of the panel, his weathered face showing the strain of presiding over what had become a politically charged investigation. To his right sat Lieutenant Colonel Janet Rodriguez, the chief of flight safety, whose reputation for thorough investigations was matched only by her tendency to find fault with everyone involved in an accident. To his left was Major General Patricia Hayes, whose presence indicated just how seriously the Air Force was taking this incident. The questions had been coming for hours, each one probing deeper into Sarah's decisions and actions during the emergency. Every choice she'd made was being second-guessed by people who had the luxury of perfect hindsight and had never faced a similar crisis themselves. "Captain Chen," Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez began, consulting the thick folder of documents spread before her, "when you first noticed the engine failure, what was your immediate assessment of the situation?" Sarah had been through enough accident investigations to know that every word would be scrutinized, every decision examined under a microscope. She chose her words carefully, sticking to the facts and avoiding speculation about what might have been. "My immediate priority was to maintain aircraft control and assess the extent of the damage," she replied. The engine failure was accompanied by multiple system warnings, which indicated that we were dealing with more than a simple power loss. "And the decision to continue to Fairchild rather than attempting an emergency landing at a closer field?" This question came from Major General Hayes, whose presence at the table made Sarah's stomach clench with nervousness. Given Major Bradley's medical condition and the need for immediate cardiac care, Fairchild offered the best combination of runway length and medical facilities, Sarah answered. "The closer fields would have been adequate for the aircraft emergency, but not for the medical emergency." Major Kevin Harrison, a pilot from another squadron who had been added to the investigation panel, leaned forward with barely concealed hostility. "Captain Chen has an impressive record," he said with the kind of false sincerity that barely concealed his real meaning. "But I wonder if someone with more combat experience might have handled the situation differently." The comment was a low blow, and everyone in the room knew it. Sarah had flown combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, but her role as a bomber pilot meant that her combat experience was different from that of fighter pilots who engaged in air-to-air combat. The suggestion that her lack of dogfighting experience somehow made her less qualified to handle an aircraft emergency was both unfair and irrelevant. "Major Harrison," Colonel Webb's voice carried a warning tone, "Captain Chen's combat record is not relevant to this investigation. Her handling of this emergency speaks for itself. But the damage was done. Sarah could see the doubt in some faces. Around the table, the subtle questioning of whether she had truly earned her position or had been promoted to meet diversity goals. It was the same doubt she'd faced throughout her career, the unspoken assumption that her success was the result of affirmative action rather than merit. The most difficult questions came when the panel turned to Tom Bradley's medical condition. The revelation that he had been experiencing chest pains for weeks before the flight had emerged during the medical investigation, adding a new dimension to the inquiry. "Captain, were you aware that Major Bradley had been experiencing cardiac symptoms prior to the flight?" Colonel Webb asked, his tone carefully neutral. Sarah felt a stab of guilt that had been gnawing at her since learning about Tom's concealed symptoms. "No, sir. Major Bradley showed no signs of distress during the pre-flight briefing or the early phases of the flight. His incapacitation was sudden and unexpected." "But you were aware that he had been complaining of fatigue in recent weeks?" Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez pressed. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been aware of Tom's complaints about being tired, but fatigue was endemic in military aviation. Long hours, irregular schedules, and the stress of maintaining constant readiness meant that every pilot dealt with tiredness. She had encouraged Tom to see the flight surgeon if he was concerned, but she hadn't ordered a medical evaluation. Major Bradley mentioned feeling tired, but fatigue is a common complaint among aircrew. He had not requested medical evaluation or indicated any specific health concerns. Sarah could see the investigation team making notes, and she knew that. Her decision not to ground Tom would be scrutinized by people who had never faced the impossible balance between mission readiness and crew welfare. In an environment where pilots were expected to fly regardless of minor ailments, where showing weakness could end a career, the line between acceptable fatigue and medical unfitness was often impossible to define. The technical portion of the investigation was equally challenging. The preliminary examination of the failed engine revealed evidence of metal fatigue in critical components, suggesting that the failure might have been preventable with more aggressive maintenance procedures. But the engine had passed all required inspections and had shown no signs of impending failure during pre-flight checks. "Captain, some of our maintainers are suggesting that the flight should have been canceled when they noticed unusual vibrations during the engine run-up," said Chief Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, the senior enlisted advisor for aircraft maintenance. Sarah felt her temper flare at the suggestion. "Chief, no unusual vibrations were reported to me during the pre-flight inspection. If maintenance personnel had concerns about engine condition, those concerns should have been documented and communicated to the aircrew." The exchange highlighted one of the perennial tensions in military aviation, the balance between operational requirements and maintenance concerns. Maintainers, focused on the mechanical condition of the aircraft, often advocated for conservative approaches that prioritized equipment preservation. Aircrew, focused on mission completion, sometimes pushed aircraft harder than maintainers preferred. The investigation stretched on for 3 grueling weeks, with Sarah's every decision dissected and analyzed by committees of officers who had never faced similar emergencies. The subtle discrimination she had fought her entire career became overt as questions were raised about her experience level, her decision-making under pressure, and whether the Air Force's diversity initiatives had placed unqualified pilots in critical positions. Through it all, Sarah maintained her composure and professionalism, answering questions with the same calm precision she had shown during the emergency itself. But inside, she was struggling with doubts about her future in the Air Force, and whether the career she loved was worth the constant scrutiny and second-guessing. The turning point came when Tom Bradley, recovering slowly in the cardiac intensive care unit, finally felt strong enough to tell the full truth about his condition. 3 weeks after the emergency landing, he asked to speak with the investigation team, and his revelations would change everything. "I need to tell you something about that night," Tom said, his voice still weak but determined as he sat up in his hospital bed. The lead investigator, Colonel Webb, had come personally to take his statement, along with a court reporter to ensure every word was recorded accurately. Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I was afraid of what it might mean for my career. Tom paused, gathering his strength before continuing. I had been having chest pains for about 2 weeks before that flight. Not severe, but noticeable. I convinced myself it was just stress or maybe a pulled muscle from working out. I didn't want to report it because I knew it would ground me. The revelation hit the investigation team like a bombshell. Here was evidence that the medical emergency had been brewing for weeks, symptoms that might have prevented the entire crisis if they had been reported to medical personnel. Major Bradley, why didn't you report these symptoms to the flight surgeon? Colonel Webb asked. Tom's expression was filled with regret and shame. Because I was scared, sir. Scared of losing my flight status, scared of the medical board, scared of ending my career over what I hoped was nothing serious. The admission exposed a systemic problem in military aviation that went far beyond one pilot's poor judgment. The culture of pushing through pain, of hiding minor ailments to maintain flight status, was widespread throughout the Air Force. Pilots regularly flew with headaches, stomach problems, and other minor issues that might technically disqualify them from flight duty, because the consequences of reporting illness could be career-ending. The irony, Tom continued, is that if I had reported the symptoms and been treated, I probably could have continued flying. The cardiologist says my heart attack was caused by a blood clot in one of my coronary arteries. If they had caught it early, they could have prevented it with medication or a simple procedure. The medical team had already reached similar conclusions. Dr. Michael Chun, the cardiologist treating Tom, had reviewed his case and determined that the heart attack could likely have been prevented with proper screening and treatment. The symptoms Tom had been experiencing were classic warning signs of coronary artery disease, easily treatable if caught in time, but perhaps the most important part of Tom's statement came when he addressed questions about Sarah's performance. As aircraft commander, I want to make something absolutely clear, Tom said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about his friend and colleague. Captain Chun saved my life and the lives of our entire crew. There's no way she could have known about my cardiac symptoms, because I deliberately concealed them. If anyone is to blame for what happened, it's me, not her. The statement vindicated Sarah's command decisions and put the medical emergency into proper context. She had not failed to recognize warning signs in her co-pilot. Those signs had been deliberately hidden from her by a pilot who feared the consequences of reporting illness. As the investigation team dug deeper into the technical aspects of the emergency, more evidence emerged of Sarah's exceptional performance. The flight data recorder, which had captured every detail of the aircraft's behavior during the crisis, showed that her control inputs had been textbook perfect throughout. The emergency. Aviation safety experts who reviewed the data were unanimous in their praise. The way Sarah had managed the asymmetric thrust condition after losing 2 engines was described as masterful by one expert. Her decision to continue to Fairchild rather than attempting an emergency landing at a closer field was validated when analysis showed that the shorter runways at alternate airports would not have been adequate for the damaged aircraft. Most impressively, computer simulations of the emergency showed that many pilots, faced with the same combination of failures, would not have been able to maintain control of the aircraft. The simultaneous engine failures on opposite wings created an aerodynamic situation that was at the very edge of the B-52's controllable flight envelope. What Captain Chun accomplished that night, said Dr. Robert Kim, a NASA test pilot and flight safety expert who reviewed the case, represents some of the finest emergency flying in recent memory. The fact that she was able to maintain aircraft control and execute a successful landing under those conditions critiques to exceptional skill and judgment. The technical vindication was accompanied by revelations about the bias that had influenced the initial investigation. Several members of the investigation panel had raised questions about Sarah's qualifications that had more to do with her gender and ethnicity than her performance. The suggestion that her lack of fighter pilot experience somehow made her less qualified to handle an emergency was particularly egregious, since bomber pilots regularly dealt with complex system failures that fighter pilots rarely encountered. 6 weeks after the emergency landing, Sarah stood at attention in a hangar at Fairchild Air Force Base as General Patricia Morrison, the commanding general of Air Mobility Command, pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross on her uniform. The medal's ribbon added another splash of color to the collection of decorations that reflected her 22-year career. "Captain Chen," General Morrison said as she stepped back to salute, "your actions on the night of February 15th represent the finest traditions of military aviation. In the face of multiple catastrophic failures, you demonstrated the skill, courage, and leadership that exemplify what it means to be an Air Force officer." The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, fellow aviators, senior officers, family members who had flown in from across the country, and members of the media who had been following Sarah's story. But the moment that meant the most to Sarah was when Tom Bradley, still recovering but determined to attend the ceremony, stood and applauded along with the rest of the assembled crowd. Tom was wearing civilian clothes now, having accepted a medical retirement that would allow him to pursue a second career in aerospace engineering. His presence meant everything to Sarah, a visible reminder that their harrowing night over the Pacific Northwest had ended with all crew members alive and safe. The ceremony also recognized Wright and Santos, who received air medals for their performance during the emergency. Their calm professionalism under extreme stress had been crucial to the successful outcome, and Sarah was gratified to see their contributions acknowledged. But the recognition went beyond individual medals. General Morrison announced that Sarah was being promoted to major and assigned as commander of the 394th Bomb Squadron at Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri, one of the premier B-52 stealth bomber units in the Air Force. It was a plum assignment, the kind of position that was typically reserved for the most promising officers in the bomber community. "Major Chen will be the first Asian American woman to command a stealth bomber squadron," General Morrison announced. Her appointment reflects not just recognition for her heroic actions during the emergency, but confidence in her leadership abilities and her potential for continued advancement. The appointment was groundbreaking in ways that extended far beyond Sarah's personal career. Her selection to command one of the Air Force's most prestigious squadrons sent a clear message that diversity was not just tolerated, but actively valued. At the highest levels of military aviation, in her remarks to the assembled crowd, Sarah spoke about the lessons learned from the emergency and its aftermath. 3 months ago, I faced the greatest challenge of my flying career," she said. "But what I learned from that experience wasn't just about managing aircraft emergencies or making decisions under pressure. I learned about the importance of teamwork, about the value of thorough preparation, and about the strength that comes from never giving up." She paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd, many of them young officers who would face their own challenges and barriers as their careers progressed. "I also learned that success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about creating opportunities for others, about breaking down barriers so that the next generation can climb higher than we ever imagined." The speech was well received, but Sarah's most meaningful conversation of the day came afterward, when she had a chance to speak privately with Tom Bradley. "I want to thank you for telling the truth about your symptoms," Sarah said as they stood together beside the B-52 that had brought them home. "I know it wasn't easy, and I know it probably cost you some career opportunities." Tom shook his head, a slight smile playing across his face despite the obvious fatigue from attending the ceremony. "Sarah, you saved my life. If telling the truth About my mistakes helps clear your name and advance your career, then it's the least I could do. Their friendship had been strengthened by the shared experience of the emergency and its aftermath. Tom's recovery continued to progress, though, more slowly than anyone would have liked. The damage to his heart was permanent, and he would never again be able to meet the physical standards required for flight duty. But he had found new purpose as a civilian engineer working on aircraft safety systems, using his experience as a pilot to help design better emergency procedures and equipment. 2 years later, Major Sarah Chen stood on the flight line at Whiteman Air Force Base, watching her newest pilot complete her first solo flight in the B-52 Spirit stealth bomber. Second Lieutenant Jennifer Kim was the daughter of Korean immigrants, a brilliant young woman who had graduated at the top of her pilot training class and specifically requested assignment to Sarah's squadron. "She's got good hands," commented Colonel James "Thunder" Thompson, Sarah's former aircraft commander who had driven down from Kansas City to witness the milestone flight. Now retired from active duty, Thunder had become something of an unofficial mentor to young aviators, particularly those who reminded him of the eager young co-pilot Sarah had been when he first met her 15 years earlier. "She reminds me of someone I used to know," Sarah replied with a smile, remembering her own nervousness during her first B-2 solo flight just 18 months earlier. The 394th Bomb Squadron had thrived under Sarah's leadership, earning recognition as one of the top-performing units in Air Force Global Strike Command. Her approach to command emphasized technical excellence, balanced with genuine concern for the welfare of her airmen, creating an environment where people could perform at their highest levels while knowing their commander cared about them as individuals. The squadron had also become known as a place where women and minorities could succeed, without facing the subtle discrimination that still existed elsewhere. In the Air Force, Sarah had made it clear from her first day in command that performance was the only metric that mattered, and that prejudice or harassment of any kind would not be tolerated. One of her proudest accomplishments as squadron commander had been the establishment of a formal mentorship program that paired experienced aviators with newcomers to the bomber community. The program had been so successful that it was being adopted by other squadrons throughout Air Force Global Strike Command. Leadership isn't just about giving orders or making decisions, Sarah would tell the young officers in the program. It's about creating an environment where everyone can succeed, regardless of their background or their appearance. It's about judging people by their performance and their character, not by stereotypes or assumptions. The mentorship program had already produced tangible results. Several young officers who had participated in the program had been selected for advanced training or prestigious assignments, and the squadron's overall performance metrics had improved significantly. More importantly, exit surveys showed that airmen felt more valued and supported than in previous years. Lieutenant Kim's successful solo flight was just the latest example of the squadron's success in developing talented aviators. As she taxied the B-2 back to the parking area, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction with what she had accomplished. "Major Chen," Lieutenant Kim's voice crackled through the radio as she completed her post-flight procedures. "Requesting permission to shut down engines and secure aircraft." "Permission granted, Lieutenant," Sarah replied. "Welcome to the club of stealth bomber pilots. There aren't many of us, but we're glad to have you." The impact of Sarah's story had extended far beyond her own career and squadron. The investigation that followed the emergency landing had exposed systemic issues with maintenance reporting, medical screening, and emergency procedures that went far beyond the specific circumstances of her flight. Within weeks of the final report's release, new policies were implemented requiring more aggressive reporting of potential mechanical issues. Maintenance personnel were encouraged to document even minor anomalies that might indicate developing problems, and aircrew were required to take more active roles in evaluating their aircraft's condition before flight. The medical community also took notice of Tom's case. His decision to conceal cardiac symptoms for fear of losing his flight status highlighted broader issues with how military aviators approach their health. New screening protocols were developed to identify heart disease earlier and confidential. Reporting systems were established to allow aircrew to report health concerns without immediate risk to their careers. The Bradley Protocols, as they became known informally, were adopted throughout the Air Force and had already been credited with saving several lives when crew members experienced medical crises during flight. Tom's work as a civilian aerospace engineer had focused on improving these systems, and his contributions to aviation safety were beginning to rival his achievements as a pilot. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the Air Force approached discussions of diversity and inclusion. Sarah's experience during the investigation had highlighted the subtle biases that still existed in the military aviation community, and senior leadership was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about whether all aviators were truly being judged by the same standards. The conversation was led, in part, by General Morrison herself, who used Sarah's case as an example of how unconscious bias could affect even well-intentioned investigations. In speeches at military academies and professional development courses, she spoke frankly about the different standards that women and minorities often faced, and the need for leaders to examine their own assumptions and prejudices. Excellence has no gender, no ethnicity, no background, Morrison would say. But recognition of excellence sometimes does, and that's something we need to change. The impact of these discussions rippled through the Air Force community, prompting conversations about fairness, opportunity, and the true meaning of merit-based advancement. It wasn't a complete transformation. Institutional biases built over decades couldn't be eliminated overnight, but it was a beginning. Progress was incremental rather than revolutionary, but it was real. The percentage of women in pilot training had increased slightly, and retention rates for female aviators had improved. More importantly, the culture was slowly changing, becoming more welcoming and inclusive for people from all backgrounds. Sarah's role in this transformation had evolved from reluctant symbol to active advocate. She spoke regularly at professional development seminars, sharing her experiences and encouraging other women and minorities to pursue leadership positions. She had also become involved in high school outreach programs, working with young people who might benefit from seeing someone who looked like them in a position of leadership. The recognition and advancement that followed the emergency landing had come with unexpected challenges. Sarah found herself in demand as a speaker, a role model, and a symbol of progress in military aviation. The attention was gratifying but also overwhelming, and she sometimes struggled to balance her new public role with her primary responsibilities as an officer and aviator. The media attention was particularly intense. News outlets that had previously paid little attention to military aviation suddenly wanted to interview the heroic pilot who had saved her crew. Television producers pitched documentary ideas, book agents offered publishing contracts, and movie studios inquired about the rights to her story. Sarah turned down most of these opportunities, recognizing that her primary obligation was to the Air Force and her fellow aviators. But she did agree to participate in a documentary about women in military aviation, seeing it as an opportunity to highlight the contributions of all the women who had paved the way for her success. The documentary, titled Breaking the Sound Barrier: Women in Military Aviation, aired 6 months after the emergency landing. It featured interviews with pioneering women pilots from World War II through the present day, placing Sarah's story in the broader context of women's struggles for equality in aviation. The film was well received and helped to educate the public about the challenges that women faced in military aviation careers. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came during the filming, when she had the opportunity to interview General Morrison about her own pioneering career. What advice would you give to young women who want to follow in your footsteps? Sarah asked during the interview. General Morrison thought for a moment before responding. I would tell them that the path won't be easy, but it will be worth it. Every barrier we break, every ceiling we shatter, makes it a little easier for the women who come after us. Your emergency landing didn't just save 4 lives, it opened doors for countless women who will serve in positions of leadership because of your example. 5 years after the emergency landing, Colonel Sarah Chen stood before the assembled crowd at the Air Force Academy's graduation ceremony. Her dress blues bore the insignia of her new rank and position as the commander of the 509th Bomb Wing, the most prestigious bomber unit in the United States Air Force. Among the graduates was Cadet First Class Maria Santos Kim, the younger sister of the Lieutenant Kim who had been Sarah's protege at Whiteman. Maria had chosen to follow her sister into aviation, but her path would take her into the world of unmanned aircraft systems, the future of military aviation that was rapidly evolving even as traditional piloted aircraft remained essential to national defense. Cadets, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. You are joining the world's greatest Air Force at a time of unprecedented challenge and opportunity. The threats we face are more complex than ever before, but so are the tools and technologies at our disposal. The speech had been months in preparation, but as Sarah looked out at the young faces before her, she found herself departing from her prepared remarks to share something more personal. 15 years ago, I sat where you're sitting now, wondering what the future would hold and whether I would be able to make a meaningful contribution to our nation's defense. I faced doubts, some from others, but mostly from myself, about whether I belonged in this profession. She paused, thinking of the journey that had brought her to this moment. The emergency landing that had nearly ended her career, but instead transformed it. The investigations and scrutiny that had tested her resolve. The gradual recognition that her success was opening doors for others who would follow in her footsteps. What I learned, through experiences both challenging and rewarding, is that excellence has no gender, no ethnicity, no background. What matters is your commitment to the mission, your dedication to your fellow airmen, and your willingness to persevere when things get difficult. And I promise you, things will get difficult. The graduates listened intently, many of them aware of Sarah's story and the significance of her presence at the podium. She was the first Asian American woman to command a bomb wing, another barrier broken in a career that had been defined by firsts and breakthroughs. But I also learned something else, Sarah continued. Your diversity is not a weakness to be overcome or ignored. It's a strength to be embraced and leveraged. The Air Force needs people who think differently, who bring different perspectives and experiences to bear on complex problems. 10 years after the emergency landing, Brigadier General Sarah Chen walked through the corridors of the Pentagon, her 1-star rank making her one of the most senior Asian American women in the entire military. Her current position as Director of Operations for Air Force Global Strike Command gave her responsibility for the strategic bomber and intercontinental ballistic missile forces that form the air-breathing component of America's nuclear deterrent. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on her shoulders, the knowledge that decisions made in her office could literally determine the fate of nations. But it was also the culmination of a career that had begun with doubts about whether she belonged in military aviation, and had evolved into leadership of some of the most critical capabilities in the American arsenal. The meeting she was heading to would address the future of strategic deterrence in an era of rapidly evolving threats. China's military modernization, Russia's development of new nuclear systems, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to smaller nations had created a security environment more complex than any the United States had faced during the Cold War. As she entered the briefing room, Sarah was struck by the diversity of the team she had helped assemble over her years in senior positions. The analysts, planners, And strategists around the table included men and women of various ethnicities and backgrounds, all united by their expertise and commitment to national security. "General," said Colonel Jennifer Kim, her former protege, now herself a senior officer and rising star in the Air Force, "we have the analysis you requested on potential modernization scenarios for the bomber force." The briefing that followed was typical of the high-level strategic planning that consumed much of Sarah's time in her Pentagon assignment. Complex technical information, geopolitical analysis, and budget projections combined to paint a picture of the challenges facing American air power in the decades ahead. But as Sarah listened to the presentation, she found herself thinking about the young pilot she had once been, struggling to land a damaged B-52 in the darkness over the Pacific Northwest. The technical skills that had saved her crew that night, the ability to process multiple streams of information under extreme pressure, to make critical decisions with incomplete data, to lead a team through crisis, were the same skills she used every day in her current position. 15 years after the emergency landing, Major General Sarah Chen stood in the Oval Office, one of several senior military officers briefing the President on the current status of American strategic forces. The meeting was routine, quarterly update on the readiness and capabilities of the nuclear deterrent, but Sarah never forgot the profound responsibility that came with her role. Her second star had come with assignment as the Deputy Commander of Air Force Global Strike Command, making her the second highest ranking officer in the organization, responsible for America's strategic bomber and missile forces. It was a position that placed her among the most senior military leaders in the country, with direct access to the highest levels of national security decision-making. The President, a woman who had herself broken barriers as the first female Commander-in-Chief, listened attentively as Sarah briefed on modernization efforts for the bomber force. The conversation was technical and detailed, covering everything from aircraft maintenance schedules to the development of new weapon systems. "General Chen," the President said as the briefing concluded, "I want to thank you for your service and for your leadership of such a critical mission area. I know that your path to this position wasn't always easy, and your success is an inspiration to young people across the country who might not otherwise see themselves in positions of military leadership." Sarah felt a familiar mix of pride and humility. The recognition was gratifying, but she had learned over the years that her individual success mattered less than what it represented proof that the military could successfully integrate people from all backgrounds into positions of responsibility and trust. 20 years after the emergency landing, retired Lieutenant General Sarah Chen stood at the podium of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, delivering the keynote address. At the opening of an exhibit on women in military aviation, breaking barriers, building futures, one of the centerpiece displays featured the ejection seat from the B-52 she had flown during the emergency landing that had transformed her career. Next to it was a recreation of the cockpit, complete with the warning lights and emergency procedures that had guided her actions on that crucial night. Sarah's 3 stars, earned during her final assignment as Commander of Air Force Global Strike Command, caught the light from the museum's skylights as she spoke to the assembled crowd. The audience included current and former military aviators, aerospace industry leaders, historians, and young people considering careers in aviation and aerospace. "When I first put on this uniform 43 years ago," Sarah said, gesturing to a photograph of herself as a young second lieutenant, "I never imagined that I would have the privilege of serving in the positions I've held or the opportunities I've had to contribute to our nation's defense." The speech traced the evolution of women's roles in military aviation, from the pioneering women Air Force service pilots of World War II, through the integration of women into combat roles and leadership positions. Sarah's own story was woven throughout, but always in the context of the broader struggle for equality and recognition. "Progress has not always been easy or fast," she acknowledged. There were times when I wondered if I would be able to overcome the barriers and prejudices that existed, times when it seemed like the odds were stacked against success. But I was never alone in that struggle. She spoke of the mentors who had guided her career, the colleagues who had supported her advancement, and the young officers she had been privileged to mentor in return. The network of relationships built over decades of service had been the foundation of her success and the source of her greatest satisfaction as a military leader. "The most rewarding part of my career," Sarah said as her speech neared its conclusion, "wasn't the promotions or the recognition or even the historic firsts. It was the knowledge that my service was opening doors for others, that young people who might not otherwise see themselves in positions of leadership could look at my example and believe that success was possible for them too." As the applause died down and the formal ceremony concluded, Sarah was approached by many people whose lives had been touched by her story and example. Captain Lisa Park, now a pilot with United Airlines and a former Air Force officer who had served in Sarah's wing, thanked her for making it possible for people like her to succeed in aviation. Tom Bradley, now a respected aerospace engineer and safety consultant, had traveled to Washington specifically to attend the exhibit opening. His work developing improved emergency medical systems had become his legacy, preventing countless similar incidents through better training and equipment. "Sarah," Tom said as they found a quiet corner away from the crowd, "I've been thinking about what happened that night, and I realized that the emergency landing was just the beginning of your real impact. What you've accomplished since then, the careers you've influenced, the policies you've changed, the barriers you've broken, that's the real legacy." Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, now a test pilot and one of the rising stars in the Air Force, had also come to the ceremony. Her own career progression from enlisted navigator to test pilot had been inspired by Sarah's example and made possible by the doors Sarah had opened. Master Sergeant James Wright, now retired and working as a senior engineer at Boeing, brought his daughter to meet Sarah. The young woman was a sophomore at MIT studying aerospace engineering, inspired by her father's stories and Sarah's example to pursue a career in aviation. As Sarah reflected on the evening's events, she was struck by how far the military aviation community had come since that terrifying night over the Pacific Northwest. The Air Force she was leaving behind was more diverse, more inclusive, and more welcoming to people from all backgrounds than the one she had joined 4 decades earlier. The changes weren't complete. There was still work to be done, still barriers to overcome, still prejudices to confront. But the progress was undeniable, measured not just in statistics and demographics, but in the lived experiences of the men and women who wore the uniform. Young aviators today faced challenges that were different from those Sarah had encountered. Technology had advanced, threats had evolved, and the nature of warfare had changed dramatically. But the fundamental requirements for success remained the same: technical competence, moral courage, and the determination to never give up when faced with seemingly impossible odds. The mentorship programs Sarah had pioneered had been adopted throughout the Air Force and had become a model for other services. Thousands of young officers had benefited from the guidance and support of more experienced mentors, creating a culture of development and growth that hadn't existed when Sarah was starting her career. The medical protocols that had emerged from Tom Bradley's case had prevented numerous in-flight medical emergencies, saving lives in aircraft through better screening and monitoring of aircrew health. The maintenance procedures that had been revised after the investigation had reduced engine failures and improved aircraft reliability across the entire bomber fleet. But perhaps most importantly, the conversations about diversity and inclusion that had been sparked by Sarah's experience had led to genuine cultural change within the military aviation community. Unconscious bias training, improved evaluation procedures, and more objective promotion processes had created a more level playing field for all aviators. Regardless of their background. As Sarah prepared to leave the museum that evening, she paused one final time in front of the B-52 cockpit display. The replica was remarkably accurate, complete with the instrument panels and control systems she had fought to master during that emergency landing 2 decades earlier. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, stood in front of the display with her parents, her eyes wide with wonder as she imagined herself in the pilot's seat. The girl's parents were explaining the story behind the exhibit, and Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation. She was the first Asian American woman to fly that airplane, the father was saying. She had to work twice as hard as everyone else to prove she belonged there. But she did belong there, the mother added. She proved it when she saved her crew and brought everyone home safely. The girl looked up at her parents with serious eyes. Could I be a pilot like her someday? You can be anything you want to be, her mother replied. If you work hard and never give up, there's no limit to what you can accomplish. Sarah smiled as she listened to the conversation, remembering similar discussions she had had with her own parents decades earlier. The girl's parents were telling her the same thing Sarah had learned through hard experience, that barriers existed to be overcome, that prejudice could be defeated by excellence, and that the impossible could become possible through determination and courage. As she walked toward the museum exit, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from that terrifying night over the Pacific Northwest to this moment of recognition and reflection. The emergency landing had tested her skills as a pilot and her courage as a leader, but the investigation and its aftermath had revealed something more important: her capacity to inspire others and create lasting change. The young girl standing in front of the cockpit display represented hope for the future, a generation that would face fewer barriers, encounter less prejudice, and enjoy more opportunities than Sarah's generation had experienced. It wasn't perfect equality yet, but it was progress, and Sarah had played a role in making it possible. The story that had begun with a heart attack in an engine failure had become something much larger, a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of excellence, and the possibility of change. Sarah Chen had saved 4 lives during that emergency landing, but her real legacy was measured in the countless lives she had touched and the barriers she had broken for those who would follow. As she stepped out into the Washington evening, Sarah carried with her the satisfaction of a career well lived and a mission well accomplished. The emergency that had nearly ended her career had instead become the catalyst for a transformation that would benefit military aviators for generations to come. The co-pilot had indeed suffered a heart attack, and she had indeed landed the B-52 with one engine out. But that was just the beginning of a story that would inspire and influence people for decades to come, proving that sometimes the most challenging moments in our lives can become the foundation for our greatest achievements. The story that had begun with a heart attack and an engine failure had become something much larger, a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of excellence, and the possibility of change. Sarah Chen had saved 4 lives during that emergency landing, but her real legacy was measured in the countless lives she had touched and the barriers she had broken for those who would follow. As she stepped out into the Washington evening, Sarah carried with her the satisfaction of a career well lived and a mission well accomplished. The emergency that had nearly ended her career had instead become the catalyst for a transformation that would benefit military aviators for generations to come. 5 years after her retirement, Dr. Sarah Chen, she had completed her doctorate in aerospace engineering during her final military assignment, found herself in an unexpected role as the director of the Amelia Earhart Center for Aviation Excellence at her alma mater. The position allowed her to combine her passion for aviation with her commitment to developing the next generation of aerospace leaders. The center had become a magnet for young people from underrepresented backgrounds who were interested in aviation careers. Under Sarah's leadership, it had established partnerships with major airlines, aerospace companies, and military services to create pathways for students who might not otherwise have access to aviation opportunities. One particularly successful program paired high school students from inner cities with mentors in the aviation industry. These students, many of whom had never been in an airplane, were given the opportunity to learn about flight through hands-on experiences that included simulator training, airport visits, and meetings with professional pilots and engineers. When I was growing up in rural Iowa, Sarah would tell these students, I never imagined that someone who looked like me could become a general in the Air Force. I want you to know that there are no limits to what you can achieve if you're willing to work for it. The program had already produced remarkable results. Dozens of graduates had gone on to pursue aviation-related careers, from pilots and air traffic controllers to engineers and aerospace executives. Several had been accepted to military academies or enrolled in premier aerospace engineering programs. But perhaps the most meaningful success story was that of Keisha Williams, a young woman from Detroit who had entered the program as a sophomore in high school with no knowledge of aviation beyond what she'd seen in movies. 4 years later, she was a cadet at the Air Force Academy, following in Sarah's footsteps with dreams of becoming a pilot. General Chen, Keisha had written in a letter that Sarah treasured, "When I first met you, I couldn't imagine that someone like me could belong in the cockpit of a military aircraft. But you showed me that barriers exist to be broken, and that excellence has no color or gender. Thank you for believing in me before I learned to believe in myself." The Emmy Award-winning documentary, Emergency at 35,000 Feet, the Sarah Chen story, had premiered on PBS 5 years after Sarah's retirement, bringing her story to a national audience that extended far beyond the military aviation community. The film combined archival footage, expert interviews, and dramatic recreations to tell the complete story of that harrowing night and its lasting impact. The documentary had been narrated by Tom Bradley, whose own journey from patient to advocate for aviation safety provided a compelling counterpoint to Sarah's story. His work developing better medical screening procedures for aircrew had been incorporated into the film, showing how one emergency had led to systematic improvements that benefited the entire aviation community. What people don't understand about that night, Tom said in one particularly powerful segment, is that Sarah wasn't just fighting to save our lives. She was fighting against decades of assumptions about who belongs in positions of leadership and who has what it takes to handle a crisis. The film had won numerous awards and had been used in leadership training programs throughout the military and corporate America. It had also inspired a new generation of young women to pursue careers in aviation, with flight training schools reporting increased enrollment among female students in the years following its broadcast. The success of the Earhart Center had led to an even more ambitious project, the establishment of the Sarah Chen Leadership Institute at the Pentagon. The institute, created through a partnership between the Department of Defense and several major foundations, was dedicated to developing diverse leadership talent throughout the military services. The institute's programs addressed many of the systemic issues that Sarah had encountered during her own career. Unconscious bias training, mentorship programs, and leadership development opportunities were designed to create a more inclusive environment for all service members, regardless of their background. One of the Institute's most innovative programs was the Crisis Leadership Simulation, which placed participants in high-stress scenarios similar to the one Sarah had faced during her emergency landing. These simulations taught decision-making under pressure, while also highlighting how bias and assumptions could affect judgment during critical moments. Leadership isn't just about technical competence, Sarah would tell participants in these programs. It's about maintaining clarity of thought when everything is falling apart, about inspiring confidence in others when you're not sure of the outcome yourself, and about making the right decision even when it's not the popular one. The Institute had already graduated hundreds of military officers who were applying its lessons in commands around the world. Many credited the program with helping them navigate challenging situations and with giving them the confidence to pursue leadership positions they might not have sought otherwise. Sarah's story had resonated far beyond the United States military. She had been invited to speak at military academies and aviation conferences around the world, sharing her experiences with audiences from dozens of countries. Her message of perseverance, excellence, and inclusion had universal appeal, transcending cultural and national boundaries. In South Korea, she had addressed a gathering of female military officers who were working to expand women's roles in that nation's armed forces. In Australia, she had spoken to aerospace industry leaders about the importance of diversity in developing innovative solutions to complex technical challenges. In the United Kingdom, she had participated in a Royal Air Force conference on leadership development and crisis management. These international engagements had led to collaborative research projects on aviation safety, leadership development, and diversity in military organizations. The lessons learned from Sarah's experience were being incorporated into training programs and policy development efforts around the world. One particularly meaningful collaboration had been with the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, where Sarah's heritage and experience resonated strongly with female officers who faced similar challenges in a traditionally male-dominated organization. The partnership had resulted in exchange programs and joint training exercises that benefited both nations' military aviation communities. Now in her 70s, Sarah often reflected on the journey that had taken her from a young girl in Iowa who dreamed of flying to a retired general whose story had inspired thousands. The path had not always been easy, and there had been moments when she had questioned whether the struggle was worth the cost. The emergency landing that had defined her legacy had lasted only a few hours, but its impact had extended across decades. What had begun as a fight for survival had become a catalyst for change that was still reverberating through the military aviation community and beyond. Sarah's marriage to Dr. Michael Harrison, a fellow Air Force officer turned aerospace engineer, had provided stability and support throughout her career. Their two adopted children, both now successful professionals in their own right, had grown up understanding the importance of service and the value of breaking barriers for others. Her son, Captain David Chun Harrison, had followed her into the Air Force and was now a pilot flying the F-35 Lightning II. Her daughter, Dr. Lisa Chun Harrison, had become a NASA engineer working on the next generation of space exploration vehicles. Both credited their mother's example with teaching them that determination and excellence could overcome any obstacle. "Mom always told us that success wasn't just about personal achievement," David had said in a recent interview. "It was about using your platform to lift others up and create opportunities for people who might not otherwise have them." That lesson has guided everything I've done in my own career. Even in retirement, Sarah remained active in causes close to her heart. She served on the boards of several aviation-related organizations and continued to mentor young officers and aspiring aviators. Her schedule was packed with speaking engagements, consulting projects, and volunteer activities that kept her connected to the community she had served. Throughout her career, one of her most cherished roles was as a volunteer at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where she regularly led tours for school groups and answered questions from visitors interested in military aviation history. Children were particularly drawn to her story, and she never tired of encouraging young people to pursue their dreams regardless of the obstacles they might face. "Every time I tell this story," Sarah would say to these young visitors, "I'm reminded that the most important lesson isn't about flying airplanes or handling emergencies. It's about never giving up, even when the odds seem impossible. It's about believing in yourself when others doubt you, and about using your success to help others achieve their own dreams." The Sarah Chen Foundation, established with proceeds from her book and speaking engagements, had become a major force in promoting diversity in aviation and aerospace careers. The foundation provided scholarships, mentorship programs, and career development opportunities for underrepresented students interested in STEM fields. Over the past decade, the foundation had awarded more than $10 million in scholarships and had helped thousands of young people access aviation education and training opportunities. Many of these scholarship recipients had gone on to successful careers as pilots, engineers, air traffic controllers, and aerospace executives. The Foundation's annual gala had become one of the premier events in the aviation community, bringing together industry leaders, military officers, and young professionals to celebrate achievement and promote diversity. Each year's keynote speaker was typically a person whose career had been influenced by Sarah's example, or who represented the kind of barrier-breaking achievement the Foundation sought to promote. The goal isn't to create a world where Sarah Chen's story is remarkable, she had said at the most recent gala. The goal is to create a world where stories like mine are so common that they're unremarkable, where excellence is recognized and rewarded regardless of gender, race, or background. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 30 years after the emergency landing that had changed her life, Sarah found herself back in the cockpit of a B-52 Stratofortress. The aircraft was a museum piece now, permanently grounded and displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, but sitting in the pilot's seat brought back a flood of memories from that terrifying night over the Pacific Northwest. The museum had organized a special commemoration of the anniversary, bringing together the surviving members of the original crew and many of the people whose careers had been influenced by Sarah's story. Tom Bradley, now in his 80s but still sharp and engaged, had traveled from his home in Oklahoma to participate in the ceremony. 30 years ago, we were just trying to survive, Tom said as they sat together in the cockpit where they had faced their greatest challenge. We had no idea that night would become the foundation for so many positive changes. Sometimes the most difficult moments in our lives create opportunities we never could have imagined. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, now a retired lieutenant colonel and successful airline pilot, had also returned for the anniversary. Her navigation skills had been crucial during the emergency, and her own subsequent career had been another example of how the barriers Sarah had broken had created opportunities for others. Technical Sergeant James Wright, the electronic warfare officer whose calm professionalism had helped save the crew, had passed away 5 years earlier, but his widow and children were present to honor his memory and his contribution to that night's successful outcome. As the commemoration ceremony concluded, Sarah was approached by a young Air Force lieutenant who introduced herself as the great niece of one of the women Air Force service pilots from World War II, Lieutenant Sarah Kim. She had been named after Sarah Chen, was preparing to begin B-51 Raider training, the newest generation of strategic bomber that would carry the Air Force into the future. General Chen, the young officer said, I wanted to thank you for making it possible for people like me to serve in roles like this. When I was growing up, my great-aunt would tell me stories about the women who flew during World War II, and she always said that their sacrifices would only be meaningful if future generations continued to break down barriers. The conversation reminded Sarah that her story was part of a much larger narrative that stretched back to the earliest days of aviation and would continue long after she was gone. Each generation of aviation pioneers had faced its own challenges and had fought its own battles for recognition and opportunity. Her contribution was just one chapter in an ongoing story of progress and inclusion. Lieutenant, Sarah replied, the most important thing I can tell you is that your success will inspire others, just as the success of those who came before us inspired us. Never forget that you're not just representing yourself, you're opening doors for people who will follow in your footsteps. As Sarah left the museum that day, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her From that emergency landing to this moment of recognition and celebration, the frightened pilot who had fought to save her crew 30 years ago had become a symbol of excellence, perseverance, and the power of diversity in creating stronger organizations and communities. The lessons learned that night about leadership under pressure, about the importance of preparation and training, about the value of teamwork and mutual support, had been applied in countless situations over the intervening decades. The story had become larger than any single person or incident, evolving into a testament to human resilience and the possibility of positive change. Sarah's legacy was not just in the lives she had saved during the emergency, or even in the barriers she had broken during her subsequent career. It was in the countless young people who had been inspired by her example to pursue their own dreams, in the policies and procedures that had been changed to create more inclusive organizations, and in the cultural shifts that had made it possible for excellence to be recognized and rewarded, regardless of its source. The emergency that had begun with a co-pilot's heart attack and an engine failure had become a story of hope, determination, and the transformative power of leadership. It was a reminder that in our most challenging moments, we have the opportunity to not just survive, but to create lasting positive change that extends far beyond our immediate circumstances. As she drove away from the museum, Sarah thought about the young lieutenant she had just met and the thousands of other young people who would follow in her footsteps. They would face their own challenges and encounter their own barriers, but they would do so with the knowledge that others had gone before them, had fought similar battles, and had emerged victorious. The co-pilot had indeed suffered a heart attack, and she had indeed landed the B-52 with one engine out. But that dramatic night had been just the beginning of a story that would continue to inspire and influence people for generations to come. In the end, Sarah Chen had not just saved 4 lives, she had changed countless others, proving that sometimes our greatest challenges become the foundation for our most important contributions. The flight that had begun in crisis had become an eternal journey of inspiration, education, and transformation. And like all great stories of human courage and determination, its impact would continue long after the final words were written, carried forward by each new generation of dreamers who dared to reach for the sky. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.